This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and if we want to actually explore the conversations that our sources can have in synthesis, we need some strategies on how to do that. So we're going to check that out today. Okay, folks, I am here with a good friend of mine named Holly Downey. Holly, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
And what we're going to do today, just like I mentioned before at the beginning of the video, is we are going to look into a couple different ways to help kids not only look at source material, but also try to get them into conversations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to showcase something of what I do first, and then we're going to bring Mrs. Downey in here, right, to tell us what she does, because when I saw it, I was like, this is awesome. We got to get this out there. And once again, Holly, I'm just thrilled that you're willing to do so.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Before we get into everything, though, I know that I personally hate horror films, and I was wondering, how do you feel about them?
I am a huge horror freak. Wrote a huge paper on horror movies when I was in college. So yeah, I'm a diehard zombie fan myself.
There we go. So this actually makes things way better for me, because all of my last synthesis video, which you could probably access right here, in that last synthesis video, I was like, I really hate horror films, but just so everybody knows, like, it's just my perspective, right? We've got Holly here, and maybe you'll convert me by the time we're done. I don't know. But anyway, let's actually look at what we have up on the screen here. This is the prompt that we're working with. You can access this prompt in the documents right down below. You can also access it on thegardenofenglish.com. And really what we're doing is, in my last prompt breakdown video, which I already mentioned, you can access right up in the corner, what I showed was the very first step was finding ideas. And the reason why we want to find those ideas is because those ideas are what we're going to actually argue about in our paper for our synthesis. That's what I've tried to say. This is also going to help us understand what sources can actually interact with one another. So this is the exact same prompt that I had from my last video. I've already highlighted the language that will get me to ideas. And you're going to notice that at the bottom today, I actually put a little chart here where I have all of my sources, and then I have all of the ideas that pertain to the sources, that pertain to this particular prompt that we're going to potentially argue about. And I narrowed down my ideas from my last video to just say which ones actually tie to the prompt that was given to us, which is, how does commercializing fear and horror affect how individuals respond to this kind of mysterious elements of life? Okay. So anyway, I'm going to quickly run through what I'm going to do, what I do, and then we're going to actually let Holly present what she wants, and we're going to talk about why this works so well together in how we do things. So basically what happens is, if these are the ideas that I could pull from my prompt itself, I'm going to now evaluate every source and say, does this source clearly speak to one of these ideas here? So if I go to source A, and you'll notice that it's this movie poster from Saw. I'm going to zoom out real quick. By the way, Holly, did you ever see Saw? Did you watch them?
I have seen not all of the Saw movies. There are quite a few, but yeah, I've seen several of them.
Okay, right. All I know is this. I did see the first one. Like I said, I don't love horror films, but I was not expecting the spoiler alert, by the way. I was not expecting the guy to be the one on the floor. It blew my mind. I didn't see it coming, even though it was probably quite cliche. I don't know. But anyway, so you've seen the Saw film. But anyway, if I look at this here, I'm going to say, does this visual, in terms of ideas, does it relate to, and then I'm just going to click down. I'm going to just click down. What does it clearly relate to? Now, someone might actually be able to say, hey, this Saw visual does relate to the unknown, right? Because it says up in the top, like, how much blood would you shed to stay alive? And if someone doesn't know that yet, but notice that now I kind of have to do some jumping through hoops to kind of reason out that it fits into the unknown. When we read our sources, we want to be able to say, yes, I can very clearly link up this particular source with these ideas. Horror and fear, that's super simple, right? How much blood would you give to stay alive? That relates to death. Super simple. It's a movie poster. Entertainment. Super simple. So we are looking for, where can we conspicuously see the relationship between the ideas and the sources, instead of actually just noticing, hey, if I do some mental gymnastics, I can kind of fit this square peg in the round hole. That's not what we're going for. Okay. But anyway, we're going to do this. We would do this with every single source. So we'd go to source B, we'd read it, and we'd say, okay, what ideas show up in source B here? And maybe I'd highlight the lines. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to just check off in this box here. And notice that I have like this kind of like almost cryptic kind of symbol here for our horror theme. I hope you appreciated that, Holly. I did that just for you.
Aw, thanks.
But anyway, nonetheless, I'm not sure that was authentic. Nonetheless, the thing is here is that what happens is if you match these up and you go through all of the sources and you pinpoint the ideas, notice that we can now see what sources have not only a lot of related idea discussion, but we also see what ideas are used the most or referenced the most in sources. And notice that we've got entertainment referenced the most in sources and behavior referenced the most in sources. So as I begin to think about what my argument is going to look like, I'm going to start saying, okay, how does commercializing horror actually affect, how individuals respond and deal with the macabre and the unknown? Well, I'm going to definitely make sure that I bring up people are entertained. And then if I see correlations between personal behavior in these sources, I'm going to bring up the behaviors that are actually mentioned in those sources. And boom, now I have two very clear ways of accessing this particular paper. And we've got it organized, and we can kind of see the conversation here. And it's really not that hard. I think it's a pretty easy switch to make, or a pretty easy task to see how we can get these sources to relate to one another around ideas that can then help inform us of the ideas that we're going to want to put into our thesis. And I will make a thesis video probably early next week. But anyway, right? So, Holly, this is my kind of model of getting these sources in conversation. But I asked you to come on here, and I called you up because I said, I really appreciate your model, and I think it works well. So what I'm going to do here is this. I'm going to switch over my screen, and then I'm going to ask that you present your model, and then we'll talk about how it kind of comes together, okay?
Sounds great.
All right, Holly, so this is it. This is a presentation that you made, and are you cool with us putting that in the description down below to share?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So why don't you bring us through what you do in order to get your kids to really kind of understand how the sources converse with one another, and you can even tell us about your inspiration for it.
Okay. So I just kind of started this one. I always, whenever I'm, whatever prompt I'm doing with my kids, I always want to try and set the mood with the PowerPoint that I'm doing or Google slide deck or whatever it is. So I found this great quote from John Carpenter, and I know you're not a horror fan, Tim, but if you were, you would know him as one of the most prolific horror film directors.
I'm willing to change. I'm not going to lie. If I'm convinced, maybe I'll change someday.
All right. Well, hopefully I can convince you. But anyway, one thing he always said about, making a good horror movie is the secret to making a good horror movie is the scare and just making sure that it's scary. And that if you've got that scare element in there, then the rest will all kind of fall into place. So I might start class by talking to my students about, what this quote means. What does it mean to be scared? I also might bring in an episode of The Simpsons. I'm sure we're all familiar with the time that the first Treehouse of Horror, when Lisa read The Raven and had Bart and Homer and everybody kind of acting it out. And at the end, Bart was like, yeah, that wasn't really scary. And so she mentions like, well, maybe people were easier to scare back then. So I think that's another good conversation that could kind of get the brain cells moving, going, popping to really think about the prompt itself.
Well, you know what, just real quick, if you actually were to even get kids thinking about this idea of what is scary, they're most likely going to be listing ideas anyway. So think about how that could even relate to the activity that I just showed where it's like, hey, what are the ideas? So we've got a lot of ideas circulating that are on task with the prompt. And that's a great way to introduce it. But anyway, let's move to here and we can keep going.
Okay, so directions are up there. I'm not going to go through each and every one because obviously you guys can read them for yourself. The only thing I'll say is that I am going to give Tim a template for this. This activity is meant to be done by hand and manipulated, so really good for those of you who are in person right now. If, however, you are fully virtual, like I myself am, you could easily do this through sharing PowerPoints or sharing Google slide decks and have them manipulate the shapes and the objects. But like I said, ideally you would do this, give them a big piece of poster board, give them a template to cut out the different shapes that they will need. Because what they'll find is that they can move them around, and while two sources may be having one conversation, two other sources are having a different conversation somewhere else. So they can really kind of move around and manipulate and see how they interact with one another based on those conversations that they're having.
All right, so let's see what we actually do. Okay, so we've got these hexagons. By the way, why hexagons? What inspired this?
So hexagons seemed to be the big rage last year. A lot of activities were coming out with different ways to use the different sides to show that there are multiple ways that things can connect to one another, and that just because two things connect in one way doesn't mean that those things can't connect with something else in a different way. So by having all of those sides, you're able to show all the different connections that they may be having.
And and I guess luckily enough for us, for most synthesis prompts, there are 6 sources, there are 6 sides. It's as if it were like meant to be.
I know, it's like kismet.
Yeah.
All right, so in your first hexagon is where your prompt is going to go. So whether that be, obviously our horror prompt that Tim just went over with us, or whatever prompt you happen to decide to be using, the gist of it would go in the center there.
Right, so I'm not putting my whole prompt in there. I'm putting like the command where it's like, hey, develop your position about, or things like that, right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah. All
right. And then you can see around it, you would put the thesis of each source, or the central claim of each source, and then identify, obviously, A, B, C, D, or it would be a good opportunity to also talk to your students about the difference between whether you're going to use source A, B, C, D, or whatever, or source and the name of the person. I would just use this opportunity to talk to my kids about whatever you're going to do, be consistent.
Right. So I could put source B at the top of that the top hexagon up there, and then I could put the claim underneath it, or I could put the author's last name there, depending on how I want to teach my kids to kind of cite that. Or maybe they could put the author's last name and source B, and then put the claim there too. But yeah, that makes sense. Be consistent is absolutely, for sure, great advice for that.
Okay, so once you have the central kind of claim of the source, you want to look for evidence that's going to support you saying that that's the claim. So I would then push my students to kind of look at that and then see what are the relationships. So, is one source adding to another source? Is one source clarifying, confirming, disagreeing, agreeing, disputing? But to kind of use that space in where they connect, show what is the actual connection. And some of my students took it a step to, they came up with symbols as opposed to words there. I have some really artsy kids who like drawing and coming up with different unique ways of doing things. So it's an opportunity for those artsy kids to kind of let that part of them come out.
Well, what's really nice about this too is that if I were to, I know that we'll go through an example with our sources in just a moment, but notice that the top 3, hexagons here, the middle one adds to the source to its right, but then disputes the source on its left, so we can actually see the fluidity of this conversation here, and it actually comes out as a visual as well. So I think this the movability of these hexagons and whatnot, all centered around the prompt to make sure that we AP, which of course once again is not agony and pain or anxiety and pressure, it's answer the prompt, is really helping us here.
Okay, so once you're figuring out the relationships, you want to make sure that you have some quotes or some evidence that you might cite and utilize in order to kind of show those things. And then the last thing I tell my kids to do would be to then give me your synthesis sentence. Tell me what are the two sources doing to each other, and kind of put that into sentence form. So that's the basic gist of it. And then Tim, if you want to go to the next slide, we can kind of walk through how we did this with part of the horror prompt that you just went through. So this is not an entire completed set of the hexagon with all of the sources. Just for time's sake, we only went through and did 3 of them, but I think you'll get the general idea of how to do it.
Yeah.
So we started with Tim's prompt there, develop your position on how commercializing fear and horror affects the way individuals respond to the unknown and macabre. So there's our center hexagon. And so above that, I went straight to source D really spoke to me because it really seemed to focus a lot on how the potential for children to develop some really undesirable behaviors as a result of viewing the horror films at such a young age. So there's my quote that I would use to kind of support me saying that that is the main central claim of the piece. So I had that for source C. So then I took a look at source D, and saw that source D seemed to think that children who watch a lot of violent television at a young age are more likely to get in criminal trouble as adults. So kind of taking source C and saying, you know, source C is kind of vague about undesirable behaviors. Source D kind of goes in and tells that they are likely to be involved or get involved in some kind of criminal activity as adults. So then we had a quote for that.
And the other thing, though, too, is that Source D is really nice for this particular packet because Source D is not actually about horror films, it's about violence. And now we're seeing how, although it's not talking about the same thing, they actually end up correlating as well. But once again, we do have the quote there, too.
All right. So yeah, so here's a quote. And so to say that those two sources agree with one another, that like, yeah, kids are going to develop, you know, or like bad behavior is going to develop out of being exposed to this horror and this violence at this young age. So then we took that and put that into a synthesis sentence. Sources C and D agree that exposure to violence and horror may negatively impact a child's behavior and development into adulthood. So showing, you know, how those two sources are actually having their conversation. So then we brought in source E. And source E really talked about more the enjoyment of horror if you're able to kind of control the experience. And if you're in control of the experience, how it can actually be a delight to watch a horror movie.
And especially it's an activity to do with friends as well, is what source C says. So
yeah,
source E, sorry, yeah.
So yeah, don't horror on your own, I guess it's trying to say.
If you horror on your own, you're bound to become a bad person. But if you horror in a group, you're going to be fine, right?
You're good. You're good. All right. So then we have the quotes there that go ahead and support that idea of being in control and experiencing them with others. And so we wanted to talk about what was the relationship then between source D and source E. So source E really kind of clarifies that, you know, it's not just any child who watches any violent movie in any circumstance is going to turn out evil and terrible and go to jail. It's to say like, no, hang on.
Right.
If the kid's in control, if the kid can tell the difference between reality and fiction, and if the kid has, you know, others around with them to ground them in reality, that no, horror movies are not that bad. So it's clarifying. So source D suggests that children are more likely to become criminals if exposed to too much violence, but source E clarifies that when community experienced, they can actually build community and a stronger sense of self.
Right.
So just kind of clarifies what the effects are in these circumstances.
You know, and it even, you know, not only clarifies, but it qualifies as well. And notice that we can get kids really looking at this language of support and confirmation and agreement and disagreement and qualifying and clarifying, and you know, giving them a list of these kind of relational words to use here besides just is pro or con is going to help them really understand the nuance of what's going on as well. And I think that this is just such an awesome activity because especially you can do this with a Google slide or a PowerPoint. Have the kids move around these hexagons that are around the prompt to create different relationships, and then they can actually see the fluidity of the conversation as well. But they also now have conversations that they can put into their paragraphs. They've got the quotes that they can pull from. It's all here. It's all organized, and it's all centered around that prompt. What you could also do with this too is that if you went back to my activity with the organizing the prompts around the ideas, you could very easily just start with the idea and build out the exact same way. So you put the idea of entertainment in, which sources are, you know, deal with the entertainment, and then you just do the exact same thing, and you can see the sources and how they relate around the idea. It's a completely organic outcome of that as well. And so because of that, I think that these two ways of getting sources in communication with one another or visualizing how the sources interact with one another really fit well together. And I was thrilled when you shared this PowerPoint online community because I was like, this is great. So once again, I'm still super grateful that you decided to join up. But why don't you tell us about this right here?
Okay, so this was last year for me because I have not been in as a physical teacher since March 13th of last year. So we actually did this activity just a week or two before we went out. But anyway, they were using the college prompt. And so you can kind of see that in the center. They kind of put it in their own words. And then you can see they arranged the hexagons around, and you'll see they drew in symbols. So this is one of my artsy groups who wanted to find some way to make it a little artsy and less wordy, I guess. So yeah, they have like equal signs, plus signs, not equal signs. You know, they said that they did have some difficulty before we did this with this idea of conversations. It's something I've really pushed since the beginning of the year. And a lot of them said this finally really cemented it for them, the idea, like being able to see, you know, that just because two sources are having one conversation with each other, it doesn't mean that that source can have a different conversation with another source.
Right. It's not like when you put a source in one paragraph, you can't put more of it in another paragraph or interrelate that. And that might even really help with some sophistication and nuance, because then that could allow for a transition. You know, if I end a paragraph with source E, and then that's going to be the primary source that I use in my next paragraph that converses with another source, I mean, you could really create a nice line through your sources that can help get through your paper as well and make it a bit more complex. So, no, this is great. I absolutely love this.
Perhaps a line of reasoning.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You know, using the sources to actually help contribute to that line of reasoning in and of itself. So, Holly, I'm super grateful that you came in to join us. I'm super grateful that you're willing to share this presentation for everybody. It's going to be found right in the description down below the video. And so if you want to access these documents, we will get them there and editable for you, or at least we'll try to. As always, as we wrap things up here, the easiest way that you can support the Garden of English is to just click like and subscribe. We also in our have our website, thegardenofenglish.com, where you can access free resources and some posters and things that we sell. You can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, so we look forward to seeing you over there as well. And I admitted this in my last video, and I have to admit it again today. My wife did convince me to create a TikTok. There's not a lot of content on there right now, but I'm sure that we'll start building it as we get closer to exam time. So, Holly, thank you. Oh, wait, by the way, Holly, where are you from?
I am from the place where bad things happen, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to real quick give a shout out to my Franklin Town Warriors, my AP Landgangers. Hi, guys.
Yeah, there we go, right? So, no, Holly, I appreciate you. I appreciate you signing in on this, and I look forward to being able to do the reading in person again in the future so we can actually meet in person next time and share some laughs together. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Tim.
Have a great one.